Good morning and welcome to worship at First Baptist. We're glad that you're here for our online worship. We believe that even though we may gather in these virtual spaces, that we are together, and it is the Spirit of God that joins us together in this place. This morning we will begin worship with a reading from Psalm 86. This will be verses 11 through 17. It says, "Teach me your way, Lord, that I may rely on your faithfulness. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. I will praise you, Lord my God, with all my heart. I will glorify you forever. For great is your love toward me. You have delivered me from the depths, from the realm of the dead. Arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you. But you, Lord, are compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Turn to me and have mercy on me. Show your strength in behalf of your servant. Save me because I serve you just as my mother did. Give me a sign of your goodness that my enemies may see it and be put to shame. For you, Lord, have helped me and comforted me." The Lord does help and comfort us. Over the next few weeks, the month of September, we will be examining what it is to use our memory in service and worship to God. And we will look today at what happens when Jacob recognizes and remembers that God is with him, and the significance of this dream that Jacob has at a place called Bethel. And so this morning we will begin that journey of remembering and seeing where God has worked before and where God may work again. We're glad that you're here this morning for worship. Today we will begin by reading from Genesis 28. We'll be reading verses 10 through 22. This is the story of Jacob's dream at Bethel. And we'll recount some of the story here in just a moment, but we'll read the text first today. It says, "Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Where he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, 'I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you.' When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, 'Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it.' He was afraid and said, 'How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven.' Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, 'If God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and the stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me I will give you a tenth.'" Jacob has this remarkable experience with God in the wilderness in this place called Luz that he would rename Bethel. It is a remarkable story of seeing how God is at work in places where we did not know it originally. And so this morning I want us to maybe look back and examine our own lives to where we might say, as Jacob did in verse 16, "Surely the Lord is in this place and I was not aware of it." To become aware of those places where God has shown up and where God has been. We're not always aware of them in the moment. Sometimes it is only in looking back we realize that God was present all along. Much like the men on the road to Emmaus, they say, "It's you." They didn't realize that God was with them until God had left, till Jesus had left. And so it is with us as well. Often we don't recognize that God is at work with us, that God is speaking to us, present with us, until maybe we have moved on and it is time for us to reflect and see and look at the ways God has taken care of us. Over the coming week, we will remember the 20th anniversary of 9/11. It is hard to imagine that 2 decades have gone by since that terrible day. I know many people remember exactly where they were. We certainly remember the visions on the television screen that we saw, what we looked at. It will be impossible to forget. And in those days afterwards, many people's lives unraveled, everything they knew taken away from them, what they loved, people they cared about, gone in an instant. There's a story I read recently this week that is very long and complex about a young man named Bobby McIlvaine who died at the age of 26 on September 11th as the towers fell. And it's a tremendous story about his family, about how they lived on after his death, about his own life and the influence that he had even at the age of 26. But in that story, something struck me. It is, Bobby was quite a writer. He wrote many things. He had a lot of journals. He was working on a couple of different novels, even while he worked at an ad agency in New York City. And so Bobby had written many things down, and after his death, going through his things, they looked through all of these, his parents, his brother, his soon-to-be fiancée. He had only 2 days prior to September 11th had asked his fiancée's father if he could marry her, and he had yet to propose. He had a ring, but had not yet done it. And so all these people who cared about him the most began to read through what he had written, maybe to find something for a eulogy, maybe to hold on to something. It's a long and complicated tale, but after going through all this and after his funeral, one of the things that they remembered about him was something that was written in those journals, and it said, "Life loves on." It was said in his eulogy by his soon-to-be fiancée, and that is something that had stuck with them. His mom has a necklace that says "Life loves on." His father had it tattooed on his skin. To remember their son, they remembered his words, "Life loves on." And it's something that has stuck with them. And in the course of this story about him, the author of the article goes through many of these journals, and as he looks at the journals, he realizes that it actually doesn't say "life loves on." It says "life lives on," in talking about the death of a person that was close to him in the previous year. And so in conversations with the parents and the fiancé, it comes to their realization that that is not exactly what he had written. But they said this is something that has gotten us through the last 20 years. I believe that it was God speaking to us through their son. And a pretty remarkable thing to think about, that God would work in a way taking something that was hard to read, an I and an O, maybe a loop there, and God giving comfort to a family, to people who needed it in the most desperate time and the most desperate place. And we see that today with Jacob. Maybe not in quite as desperate a time and place as the McIlvaine family, but certainly having his own troubles, much of it of his own doing. We remember Jacob, this third of the patriarchs, the grandson of Abraham, the son of Isaac, the younger brother of Esau. His name even meaning heel grabber. As he came out of the womb, he was clutching his brother, and all through their life, he would work to take what was Esau's. Now, when he bought the birthright from Esau, I don't think that he necessarily stole it or tricked his brother. He bought something at a bargain price that his brother really had no interest in, but there was deception involved in stealing the blessing, which was important. And Isaac was tricked into giving Jacob the blessing, and I don't understand all the nuances of the ancient world and how the blessing couldn't be taken back once it was given, but nonetheless, Jacob, through his own cunning and deceit, had taken the blessing from his brother Esau. And he had done this, but his dreams of having all that was there to his family were not to be. His mother had found out that Esau wanted to kill him, and so she told him, "You need to leave," and she sent him back to Haran, where they were from originally, where Abraham was from. And so Jacob, this one who had the birthright and the blessing, the one who we know now to be the third of the patriarchs, the one whose name would be changed to Israel, which we will look at in next week's sermon. But this one, Jacob, is now on the run. His dreams are not coming to fruition like he had thought. Things have unraveled. He is all alone, going from one place to another. And even as his father gave him the blessing, and he reminded him about the promise that God gave to Abraham and the promise that God gave to Isaac, about the descendants being as numerous as the sand on the seashore, the stars in the sky, giving them this land that they were to inherit, that God would be with them and be their God. Isaac gives that back to Jacob. And yet in that moment, Jacob is not inheriting the land. Jacob is returning to where it all started. It is almost as if Jacob in this story is reversing everything that has gone on with his father and grandfather. It is seeming that the promise that God has given to them is unraveling as Jacob, the one who has the blessing, is leaving this place, is going backwards, seemingly rewinding what God had done through the faithfulness of Abraham and Isaac. And he goes and he leaves, and it says he stops at a certain place. And we don't know the name of this place, and he doesn't really recognize it for anything other than the sun had gone down and he needed a place to stop. And he didn't find another person or a family that would offer him hospitality. No, he is out in the middle of the wilderness and the desert, and it says he uses a stone for a pillow. This is remarkable to me, not just because it seems very uncomfortable to use a stone for a pillow, but it kind of reminds me of the mopiness that Jacob would be having right now. I guess I'll just use this rock as a pillow to comfort me in this dark time. And while much of this was his own doing and cunning that got him to this point, nonetheless, Jacob is alone, deserted, and has never really had his own encounter with God until this moment he has this dream at this place. And it's in this dream that he sees angels ascending and descending, going back and forth from the heavenly realm to the earthly realm, seemingly to say that God is in control, and all around him, angels are at work. God is at work. And while he might not be able to see it, God has power over everything. God is able to do anything. The heavenly beings are at God's disposal, and they are there. And it's in this dream that God speaks to Jacob. God is standing above all of it, above these heavenly beings, a place of authority. And he says to him, I am the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, and I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out to the west, the east, the north, and the south, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. I'll bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until what I have promised to you. A remarkable thing. Jacob has his own experience with God in this place, and prior to this, he had never done it. And he wakes up from this dream and he says, surely the Lord was in this place, even though I did not know it. One thing in reflecting on 20 years after 9/11 and the last 18 months of our life dealing with this COVID pandemic is that we have expected God to show up in certain ways. We have expected life to work in certain ways, and often in a moment we realize that A, we're not in control, and then B, things aren't as balanced as we may think. We could be thrown off at any moment in time. It doesn't have to be something that affects a whole entire country, or in this case, in 2021, the entire world. No, it can just happen and shake up our own lives, but we know that things can be shaken up, that we might be using a stone for a pillow all alone in the darkness, needing God to show up in some way. We count on God to show up in certain ways, and there are times in our life where God still shows up even though we didn't expect it. The world seems to be turned upside down, and it takes a moment for us to realize that God is there. I wonder in this pandemic if maybe our homes have become the place where we find holiness, or as Jacob would say here, the very gate of heaven. And not just worshiping in front of a TV screen, but the moments where we find holiness. To think for a moment in our own journeys where God has shown up. Jacob would anoint this place, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but Jacob would name this place and rename it Bethel, or house of God, and he would go back there. Several chapters later, God tells Jacob to go back there, to go to this place where God appeared to him. It's a place of meaning and significance because God and Jacob were together. But I wonder if we would reflect for a moment to a place where God had shown up and we did not expect it. Or maybe we did not know it. Maybe we became aware of it in the moment. Maybe we've never become aware of it until we think about it right now, that there was a moment where all seemed lost and alone, but God was there. I think of a couple of moments for myself like this. I remember being alone in a crowded room in a sanctuary at a worship service, which is a place where a minister should not feel alone, particularly one who is employed by that congregation, and yet I felt all alone in a moment. I didn't want to divulge all of the things that were hurting me, that had me down in my life, and so I sat alone in a worship service. It's the only thing I could think to do at the moment, and I sat there. And it was in that moment that there was a stained glass of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And it was in that moment that I felt like the sheep and that God was carrying me, that I was literally on the shoulders of Jesus. It's hard to explain, but in that moment I felt like God was present. It wasn't until a day or two later that I really kind of processed that. And I thought about that moment, that God was present. Or I can remember another time in my life dealing with sadness again, and I remember just the comforting touch of someone to say, "I'm sorry." Many people had done it, but there was one that I remember, and it was the presence of God. Or I remember at my own ordination for ministry, I remember the weight of my grandfather's hands as he prayed for me in that moment. And it wasn't until years later that I recalled that moment and thought, the presence of God was there in those hands in that room praying for me. This happens all the time to us. We can look back and remember that God was present in a moment that we did not expect it, that we did not know it, that the gates of heaven may have come down and been with us. So, church, today I want us to look at those places where we might say, like Jacob, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." Where we might say, "How awesome is this place?" This is none other than the house of God, the gate of heaven. God shows up to be with us, to reiterate promises that God has given to us, that God is there. Or even now, as we know in Jesus Christ, through the power of the resurrection, the promise, not just that God will be with us, but God will be with us, and God is present, making everything new. Reversing sin and death and decay, making us new creations, bringing and promising new creation to everything. That is what God is doing. And in the story, God is confirming to Jacob the promises that he made to his father and grandfather, and God continues to show up to us, even in these stories of old, to help us remember that God still shows up for us. And what happens in the story, too, is that when Jacob marks the land, he doesn't just set up a rock and say, "Hey, this is a special place," but there is a new insight for him. He discovers his role as a patriarch. God's promise is with him, and even though he was going back to Haran where it started, he will come back to this place, God promises him. And he sees his place in God's story. And it renews not just the promise, but the mission, too. If you caught that in there, that you will be blessed, and through you and your offspring, you will be a blessing. The same promise that he gave to Abraham. It's a renewal of the promise, but also a renewal of the mission. And so today, as we remember the places where God has been present in our lives, the place where we may say, "Surely the Lord was in this place." It's a renewal of the promises that God has given to us, but it's a renewal of the mission that God has given us too, to be a blessing to the entire world. There is a part in the story that we'll close with today that catches me every time I read it. So Jacob doesn't really have anything with him. Jacob is on the run from his brother. He's out in the wilderness using a stone for a pillow. And after this experience with God, he just so happens to pull out a little jar of oil so he might anoint that place. And I wonder, even in his unknowing about what God would do, why he carried around a little jar of oil. I wonder if it was not just a sign of hope that God might show up, that he might not have expected God to be present somewhere, that he might anoint some rock. Maybe it was this stone that he slept on. Maybe it would be a different one. Maybe it was just in hope that God may show up. But I wonder if we would carry around a small bottle of oil. if we would be ready for when God shows up, that we might anoint the place and remember and mark it as holy. It strikes me in the story that Jacob, even though he had not had this encounter with God yet, was ready for what God might do. And I pray that we would be ready too, for God to restore the promise to us and for God to renew our mission to the entire world. And I wonder if we are ready for it, how it might affect how we live. If we might be prepared with our eyes open to see that God is at work around us, that we might be able to give thanks that God is doing something. And as it renews the mission in us, we might be ready to step in and be a minister in other people's lives, knowing that they may need to see God in that moment. You see, we are not the only ones who use a stone for a pillow. We're not the only ones who seem to be all alone. We aren't the only ones who seem to be absent from the presence of God. It is all around us. God is inviting us to remember that God is present with us, and God is asking us to act as ministers to others who find themselves alone and away from God, to say that God is near, that the very gates of heaven are close by. So maybe we would carry around a little hope with us, ready to anoint the places that God shows up. Church, I pray that God would show up to you this week. That is our prayer today, that God would show up, that we would notice it, that we would have eyes to see and ears to hear where God speaks to us, and that we would be empowered by this same God who shows up to us to show up for others so they may see that God is at work in the world. Grace and peace to you this week, church. I pray God's blessing on you, and I pray that we would see God around us every day. Amen.